The story of the Roman Empire truly begins with the Julio-Claudian Dynasty. 5 remarkable men who fundamentally transformed Rome from a republic into something entirely new, laying the groundwork for an imperial system that would endure for centuries. This dynasty marks the pivotal transition in Roman history, when the ideals of shared governance and elected officials gave way to the reality of one-man rule. What makes this period so fascinating is not simply the concentration of power, but the elaborate dance between autocratic control and republican appearances that defined these early emperors' reigns. Augustus, born Gaius Octavius in 63 BCE, grew up in relatively modest circumstances compared to his granduncle Julius Caesar. The young Octavian received a traditional Roman education, studying rhetoric and philosophy while observing the political turmoil that engulfed the late Republic. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, the 18-year-old Octavian discovered he had been named as Caesar's adopted son and heir in his will. This unexpected inheritance thrust him into the dangerous centre of Roman politics. Far from being intimidated, Octavian displayed remarkable political acumen, returning to Rome to claim his inheritance despite warnings about the risks. He quickly set about gathering support from Caesar's veterans, borrowing money to pay the bequests Caesar had left to Roman citizens, and establishing himself as Caesar's rightful successor. In these early manoeuvres, we see the first glimpses of what would become his political genius, a blend of calculated generosity, personal courage, and shrewd alliance-building. The young heir faced powerful opponents. Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted lieutenant, initially dismissed Octavian as a mere boy. The Senate, led by Cicero, saw an opportunity to use Octavian against Antony while restoring their authority. Octavian navigated these treacherous waters by first allying with the Senate against Antony, then suddenly shifting to form the second triumvirate with Antony and Lepidus in 43 BCE. This alliance, legally formalized with unprecedented powers, unleashed brutal proscriptions against their enemies, claiming over 2,000 lives, including Cicero himself. The triumvirs then defeated the Republican forces led by Caesar's assassins Brutus and Cassius at Philippi in 42 BCE. Octavian's role in this period reveals his ruthless pragmatism. He would collaborate with enemies when necessary and eliminate former allies when they became obstacles. The triumvirate was always an arrangement of convenience rather than trust. As tensions grew between Octavian and Antony, their conflict became framed in cultural and moral terms. Antony, residing in Egypt with Queen Cleopatra, was portrayed in Octavian's propaganda as having abandoned Roman values, while Octavian positioned himself as the defender of traditional Roman virtues. The conflict culminated in the naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE, where Octavian's forces commanded by Agrippa defeated the combined fleet of Antony and Cleopatra. Their subsequent suicides left Octavian as the undisputed master of the Roman world at the age of 32. Looking back, we might recognize this as the true beginning of the Roman Empire, though contemporaries would not have used such terminology. The pivotal moment in Octavian's transformation into Augustus came in January 27 BCE, when he orchestrated what appeared to be a restoration of the Republic. In a carefully choreographed meeting of the Senate, he announced that he was relinquishing his extraordinary powers and returning authority to the Senate and people of Rome. This apparent surrender of power was in reality a masterful political performance. The grateful Senate, recognizing both his sincerity and the practical necessity of his leadership, bestowed upon him the name Augustus, the Revered One, and asked him to retain control of key provinces where legions were stationed. This settlement created the illusion that the Republic had been restored, while ensuring Augustus maintained actual control over Roman military power. The true genius of Augustus lies not in the naked seizure of power, but in his ability to exercise complete authority while maintaining the facade of constitutional legality. The historian Tacitus would later describe this arrangement with piercing insight. He seduced the army with bonuses, the people with cheap food, and all with the sweetness of leisure. The Romans, exhausted by decades of civil war, were willing to exchange their political freedom for peace and prosperity. Augustus ruled for 41 years, fundamentally reshaping every aspect of Roman governance. He gradually concentrated various republican offices and powers in his person without actually eliminating them. He held the consulship repeatedly, eventually gaining consular powers without needing the office itself. He became Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, and received tribunician power, making his person sacrosanct. Though never officially declared himself king or dictator, he effectively combined these authorities under the ambiguous title of princeps, first citizen. The Senate continued to meet, and elections were still held, but real power resided with Augustus and those he favoured. This elaborate constitutional fiction allowed Romans to believe they still enjoyed their ancient liberties while accepting the practical benefits of one-man rule. Militarily, Augustus consolidated control by reducing the number of legions from over 60 to 28 and establishing a permanent professional army with standardized pay, terms of service and retirement benefits. He created the Praetorian Guard, ostensibly as his personal bodyguard but effectively serving as a military presence in Italy, where traditionally troops had been forbidden. Augustus expanded Roman territory significantly, securing the Alpine regions, pushing the frontier to the Danube, and adding Egypt as a personal province that supplied grain to Rome. In Spain he finally subdued the fierce Cantabrians after centuries of resistance. These conquests gave Rome defensible borders and access to valuable resources. However, Augustus's expansion had limits, as demonstrated by the disastrous loss of 3 legions in Germany's Teutoburg forest in 9 CE, which prompted him to advise his successor to maintain, rather than expand, the empire's boundaries. Augustus's administrative innovations proved equally transformative. He created a civil service with specialized departments handling everything from grain supply to fire protection. He overhauled the tax system, ordered the first comprehensive census of the empire, and established a courier service to improve communications. He divided Rome into 14 administrative districts with local officials and created a permanent firefighting force. Perhaps most significantly, he established the Aerarium Militare, a military treasury funded by new taxes that ensured veterans could be paid without relying on the personal wealth of generals, a key factor in past civil wars. In the provinces, he instituted standardized procedures for administration and created new colonies for veterans, spreading Roman culture throughout the Mediterranean. These reforms brought unprecedented stability and efficiency to governance, allowing trade and culture to flourish across the empire. The Augustan age marked a cultural golden period in Roman history. Augustus himself understood the power of art and literature to legitimize his rule and shape public opinion. He became a generous patron of poets like Virgil, whose epic Aeneid connected Rome's origins to divine destiny and subtly linked Augustus to Rome's mythic founder. Horace and Propertius celebrated traditional Roman values and the peace Augustus had brought. Livy's monumental history of Rome from its founding placed Augustus's achievements in the context of Roman destiny. The emperor's building program physically transformed Rome from a city of brick to one of marble, as he proudly claimed. The Forum of Augustus, Temple of Apollo, and numerous other structures created a visual language of power and legitimacy. His famous claim that "I found Rome a city of clay but left it a city of marble" was more than mere boasting. It represented the physical manifestation of Rome's transformation under his rule. Augustus cultivated an image of moral authority, promoting legislation to strengthen marriage, family values, and religious observance, positioning himself as the restorer of traditional Roman virtues after the moral decay of the late Republic. The greatest challenge Augustus faced came not on the battlefield or in the Senate, but in his own household. Despite his emphasis on family values and traditional marriage, Augustus struggled with the personal tragedies and scandals that plagued his family life. His only biological child, Julia, was exiled for adultery. His beloved grandsons, Gaius and Lucius Caesar, whom he had adopted as his heirs, both died young. His daughter and granddaughter, both named Julia, were exiled for immoral behavior. These family difficulties created a succession crisis that eventually led Augustus to adopt his stepson Tiberius as his heir, despite their difficult relationship. The succession problem reveals a fundamental contradiction in Augustus's system. He had created a republican disguise for what was effectively a monarchy, yet monarchies typically rely on hereditary succession. This unresolved tension would continue to trouble the imperial system throughout its history. When Augustus died in 14 CE at the age of 75, his body was carried to the Campus Martius and cremated. The Senate promptly declared him a god, Divus Augustus, with Tiberius as his chief priest. A witness claimed to have seen Augustus's spirit ascending to heaven, conveniently confirming his divine status. This deification established another imperial tradition that would continue for centuries. In many ways, Augustus's death marked the final transformation of his position from a collection of republican offices to something approaching sacred monarchy. The Res Gestae Divi Augusti, the achievements of the divine Augustus, was inscribed on bronze tablets before his mausoleum and reproduced throughout the empire. This remarkable document, dictated by Augustus himself, summarizes his accomplishments while carefully maintaining the fiction that he had merely restored the Republic rather than fundamentally transformed it. It represents perhaps the most successful piece of political propaganda in ancient history, shaping how Augustus would be remembered by future generations. The transition of power to Tiberius proceeded smoothly, demonstrating the stability of Augustus's system. Tiberius Claudius Nero, born in 42 BCE, came from the distinguished Claudian family and had spent his early career in military service. His connection to Augustus came through marriage. Augustus had forced Tiberius's father to divorce his mother Livia, so Augustus could marry her. As a young man, Tiberius proved his military capacity in campaigns against Alpine tribes and along the Danube frontier. His personal life was less successful. Augustus forced him to divorce his beloved wife Vespasian to marry Augustus's daughter Julia, a union that brought him misery. When Augustus's preferred heirs died, Tiberius was adopted as his successor despite their mutual distrust. Unlike Augustus, who had eagerly seized power while maintaining he didn't want it, Tiberius genuinely seemed reluctant to become emperor. In the first Senate meeting after Augustus's death, Tiberius engaged in a strange back and forth, simultaneously accepting imperial power while claiming he didn't want it. This hesitation has been interpreted variously as false modesty, genuine uncertainty about his position, or a clever maneuver to make the Senate openly acknowledge the reality of one-man rule. Whatever his motivations, Tiberius eventually accepted the powers Augustus had held, though notably refusing the title Augustus initially and objecting to being called father of the country. This reluctance would characterize his entire reign, a capable administrator who seemed to despise the political aspects of his role. In many ways, Tiberius proved an able administrator, particularly in financial matters. He maintained the systems Augustus had established, avoided costly wars, and built up a substantial surplus in the treasury. He paid careful attention to provincial administration, keeping governors in place for unusually long terms to avoid the exploitation that came with frequent turnover. When a severe economic crisis struck in 33 CE, Tiberius responded effectively, providing interest-free loans and stabilizing the financial system. He showed particular concern for the common people during natural disasters, providing relief after earthquakes and fires. These practical accomplishments have often been overshadowed by the political and personal difficulties that characterized his reign. Tiberius's relationship with the Senate proved particularly troubled. Having spent much of his career as a military commander, he lacked Augustus's political skill and patience for the elaborate deference expected in senatorial relations. The senators, for their part, had grown accustomed to the careful theatre of Augustus's rule, where their importance was acknowledged even if their power was limited. Tiberius found these performances distasteful, openly showing his contempt for flattery and obsequiousness. As one senator observed, "They had known Augustus, and now they were to serve Tiberius," a remarkably blunt acknowledgement of the reality of imperial power. Relations deteriorated further when senators began being prosecuted for treason based on casual remarks, perceived insults to the emperor, or simply falling out of favour. This increasing atmosphere of fear and suspicion would define the latter part of Tiberius's reign. The most dramatic development of Tiberius's rule came in 26 CE when he abruptly left Rome for Capri, never to return during his remaining 11 years of life. This retreat has been explained variously, as an old man's desire for privacy as discussed with Roman politics, or as a preference for the Greek culture of the island. Regardless of his motives, Tiberius's absence created a power vacuum in Rome that was filled by Lucius Aelius Sejanus, the commander of the Praetorian Guard. Sejanus gradually consolidated his influence, removing rivals, including Tiberius's son Drusus, whom he may have poisoned, and promoting his supporters to key positions. For several years, Sejanus effectively ruled Rome while Tiberius remained secluded on Capri. Just as Sejanus seemed poised to seize power completely, Tiberius struck. In 31 CE, he sent a lengthy letter to the Senate revealing Sejanus's treachery. The former favourite was immediately executed, followed by a bloody purge of his supporters. The Sejanus affair intensified Tiberius's paranoia and distrust, leading to more treason trials and executions in his final years. The ancient sources, particularly Tacitus and Suetonius, paint a dark picture of Tiberius's later years, describing him as a depraved and cruel recluse, engaging in unspeakable vices on his island retreat. Modern historians have generally taken a more sceptical view of these accounts, noting their writers' aristocratic biases and the political advantages of portraying deceased emperors negatively. Archaeological evidence suggests Tiberius maintained an active interest in governance until his death, and many of the more salacious stories likely represent political character assassination rather than historical reality. This disjunction between ancient and modern assessments of Tiberius highlights the challenges of studying Roman emperors through sources written with clear political agendas. When Tiberius died in 37 CE at the age of 77, Rome greeted the news with relief and celebration. His designated heir was his grandnephew Gaius, known to history by his childhood nickname Caligula, meaning little boot, a reference to the miniature military boots he wore as a child while accompanying his father Germanicus on military campaigns. Germanicus had been enormously popular, and his premature death in 19 CE had sparked rumours of poisoning, possibly at Tiberius's instigation. The new emperor, only 24 years old, inherited some of his father's popularity, and his accession was initially greeted with enthusiasm. The Roman people, tired of Tiberius's absence and severity, looked forward to a younger, more approachable emperor. The first months of Caligula's reign fulfilled these hopes. He recalled exiles, ended treason trials, published the imperial budget for the first time, and staged lavish games and events. He appeared to be establishing himself as a more open and generous ruler than his predecessor. This golden age, as it was called, lasted approximately 6 months before a mysterious illness struck the young emperor. Ancient sources claim this illness fundamentally altered his personality, though modern scholars debate whether this represented an actual mental deterioration, the emergence of his true character once established in power, or simply political disagreements that his enemies later portrayed as madness. Regardless of the cause, Caligula's behaviour became increasingly erratic and troubling. After recovering from his illness, he began systematically eliminating potential rivals, including Tiberius's grandson Gemellus and his father-in-law Marcus Junius Silanus. His expenditures grew increasingly extravagant, quickly depleting the treasury surplus Tiberius had accumulated. He built 2 massive ships for Lake Nemi as floating temples or palaces, constructed a bridge of boats across the Bay of Baiae, purportedly to disprove a prediction that he had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the bay, and began planning a canal through the Isthmus of Corinth. These projects required enormous resources, leading to a financial crisis and increasingly desperate measures to raise funds, including new taxes, confiscations of property, and forced contributions. Perhaps most disturbing to Roman sensibilities were Caligula's religious provocations. He insisted on being treated as a living god, establishing a temple with priests dedicated to his worship. He reportedly appeared in public dressed as various deities, including Venus, Diana, and Jupiter. He ordered the heads removed from statues of gods and replaced with his own likeness. Most outrageously, he planned to erect a statue of himself in the temple at Jerusalem, a move that would have provoked widespread Jewish rebellion had his death not prevented its implementation. These behaviours represented a fundamental violation of the careful balance Augustus had established, where emperors might become gods after death, but maintained at least the appearance of being first among equals during life. The combination of financial crisis, arbitrary executions, and religious provocations created widespread discontent. In January 41 CE, a conspiracy formed among the Praetorian Guard, led by the tribune Cassius Chaerea, whom Caligula had repeatedly humiliated. They attacked the emperor while he was attending theatrical games, stabbing him multiple times and killing his wife and daughter as well. The Senate briefly considered restoring the Republic, but the Praetorian Guard had already found a new emperor, Caligula's uncle Claudius, who had been hiding behind a curtain in the palace when the assassination occurred. Claudius, born in 10 BCE, had never been considered potential imperial material. Afflicted with physical disabilities that included a limp and partial deafness, he had been marginalized by his family and excluded from public office under Augustus and Tiberius. Instead, he devoted himself to scholarship, writing works on Etruscan and Carthaginian history that unfortunately have not survived. This intellectual background, combined with his physical limitations, made him an object of ridicule. The philosopher Seneca would later write a vicious satire depicting Claudius's deification as a pumpkinification instead. Yet behind this unpromising exterior lay a capable administrator who would prove more effective than many expected. The Year of 4 Emperors represents one of the most turbulent and revealing periods in Roman imperial history, a time when the very foundations of imperial power were exposed and tested. Following Nero's suicide on June 9, 68 CE, Rome experienced a profound political crisis that would witness 4 different men claim the imperial purple within the span of 18 months. This unprecedented succession of emperors, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian, revealed fundamental truths about the nature of imperial power that had been carefully obscured during the Julio-Claudian Dynasty. What had appeared to be a stable system of governance suddenly revealed itself as something far more precarious, built not on constitutional foundations but on the shifting sands of military support, personal loyalty, and practical necessity. As we examine this critical year, we witness not merely a sequence of power struggles, but a profound moment of revelation about the true nature of Roman imperial authority. Servius Sulpicius Galba emerged as the first contender following Nero's downfall. Born into an ancient and distinguished patrician family in 3 BCE, Galba represented old Roman aristocratic values. His career followed a traditional cursus honorum, serving as praetor and later consul under Tiberius. His military reputation was built on successful campaigns in Germany, where he commanded legions along the Rhine frontier, and later in Africa, where he served as proconsul. By 60 CE, Emperor Nero had appointed him governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, a position he held for 8 years. Throughout this long career, Galba cultivated a reputation for strict discipline and traditional values, qualities that endeared him to traditionalists but often made him appear harsh and unyielding. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he maintained a certain austere dignity, refusing to engage in the excessive flattery that characterized interactions with Nero. This personal integrity would later contribute to both his rise and his fall. The events leading to Galba's proclamation as emperor began not with him, but with Gaius Julius Vindex, governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, who rebelled against Nero in early 68 CE. Vindex did not aspire to the purple himself, but instead called upon Galba to assume leadership. Initially hesitant, Galba finally declared himself the representative of the Senate and people of Rome rather than emperor, a careful distinction that positioned him as a defender of the Republic against Nero's tyranny. When news arrived that Vindex had been defeated by the Rhine legions and had committed suicide, Galba's position appeared untenable. He withdrew to Clunia in Spain, contemplating suicide himself. However, the political situation in Rome rapidly deteriorated as Nero's support collapsed. The Praetorian Guard, previously loyal to Nero, transferred their allegiance to Galba after being promised substantial donatives. The Senate quickly declared Nero a public enemy and acknowledged Galba as emperor. Upon hearing this news, Nero took his own life, famously lamenting, "What an artist dies in me." With the death of the last Julio-Claudian emperor, the link to Augustus that had legitimized imperial power was permanently severed, creating a legitimacy crisis that would define the coming year. Galba's journey to Rome revealed much about his character and the problems that would plague his brief reign. Though elderly at 73, he marched slowly from Spain, executing supporters of Nero along the way and refusing to confirm the promised rewards to the Praetorians who had supported his cause. His entry into the city caused immediate concern when he brought with him a legion raised from Spanish civilians and sailors from the fleet, unprecedented in a city where traditional custom forbade the presence of troops. This martial entrance, combined with executions carried out without trial, suggested to many observers that Galba's rule might prove more tyrannical than the regime it replaced. The philosopher Seneca, who had been Nero's tutor and advisor before falling from favour, was reportedly dismayed by the new emperor's harshness, though as a supporter of Stoic values, he might have appreciated Galba's personal discipline. Financial austerity quickly became the hallmark of Galba's brief reign. He inherited an empire nearly bankrupt from Nero's extravagance and the massive rebuilding projects following the Great Fire of Rome. Determined to restore fiscal stability, Galba implemented severe economic measures, cancelling many gifts Nero had bestowed and demanding repayment of substantial portions of others. He refused to pay the donative promised to the Praetorian Guard, allegedly stating that, "I choose my soldiers, I do not buy them." While fiscally responsible, these decisions proved politically disastrous. The historian Suetonius captures the fundamental contradiction of Galba's approach with the observation that he was capable of ruling the empire had he never ruled. His principles, admirable in a private citizen, proved inflexible in an emperor who needed to build coalitions of support. The perception grew that the aging emperor was under the influence of three close advisers: Titus Vinius, Cornelius Laco, and the freedman Islus, whom critics called his pedagogues. They were widely blamed for many unpopular decisions, creating the impression of an emperor manipulated by an inner circle. The question of succession further complicated Galba's position. With no children of his own, he needed to designate an heir to provide stability. Many expected him to choose Otho, the governor of Lusitania, who had been among his earliest supporters. Instead, Galba selected Piso Licinianus, a young nobleman with a reputation for traditional virtue similar to his own. While perhaps a principled choice, this decision fatally alienated Otho and further distanced the Praetorian Guard, who had hoped for financial rewards from a new designation. The historian Tacitus, in his inimitable style, captures the essence of Galba's failure. Everyone would have agreed he was worthy of the empire if he had never been emperor. This penetrating assessment reveals how personal virtues do not necessarily translate into political effectiveness, particularly in times requiring flexibility and coalition building. Galba's assassination came swiftly and brutally. On January 15th, 69 CE, Otho, the disappointed heir apparent, offered sacrifices at the Temple of Apollo before proceeding to the Praetorian camp, where he was proclaimed emperor. When news reached Galba, conflicting reports initially suggested that the revolt had been suppressed. The elderly emperor ventured into the forum where he was confronted by soldiers loyal to Otho. No one stepped forward to defend him. According to Tacitus, his final words were, "Strike, if it serves the state." Before he was cut down, his head severed and paraded on a pike. Piso Licinianus, his designated successor, was dragged from the Temple of Vesta where he had sought sanctuary and likewise executed. Galba had ruled for only 7 months. The swift rise and fall of Galba forces us to contemplate how legitimacy is established in times of crisis. The Julio-Claudians had based their authority largely on familial connection to Augustus, combined with control of the military and acceptance by the Senate. Galba, lacking any dynastic claim, attempted to ground his legitimacy in traditional republican virtues and senatorial approval. Yet this proved insufficient when not backed by the practical foundations of power: military support, financial resources, and popular approval. His fall revealed that imperial authority rested less on legal principles than on a complex negotiation between various power centres: the army, the Praetorian Guard, the Senate, and the people of Rome. This harsh reality would become increasingly apparent as the year of 4 emperors unfolded, laying bare the mechanisms of power that Augustus had so carefully concealed beneath constitutional forms. Marcus Salvius Otho, who seized power from Galba, presented a striking contrast to his predecessor. Born into an Etruscan family that had only recently entered the ranks of Roman nobility, Otho had been a close companion of Nero during the young emperor's early years. Handsome, fashionable, and fond of luxury, he represented everything Galba was not. His connection to Nero ran deeper than mere friendship. He had been married to Poppaea Sabina before apparently surrendering her to the emperor, receiving the governorship of Lusitania as compensation. This exile to a remote province might have ended his political ambitions, but when Galba declared against Nero in 68 CE, Otho quickly aligned himself with the uprising, becoming one of Galba's earliest and most significant supporters. His motivation appears to have been a calculated belief that the elderly Galba would adopt him as heir, positioning him to eventually succeed to the purple. When Galba chose Piso instead, Otho moved quickly and decisively. Heavily in debt and with few options remaining, he approached the Praetorian Guard with promises of generous rewards. A small group of soldiers initially proclaimed him emperor, and others rapidly joined when offered substantial bribes. The speed of events suggests careful planning. Within hours, Otho controlled the Praetorian camp, and Galba lay dead in the Forum. The Senate, always practical, quickly recognized the new emperor that same evening. Otho's seizure of power demonstrated the growing importance of the Praetorian Guard in imperial politics. Created by Augustus as the emperor's personal bodyguard, the Praetorians had now become kingmakers, a dangerous precedent that would repeatedly affect imperial succession in the coming centuries. Otho's brief reign reveals unexpected depths to his character. Despite his reputation for luxury and self-indulgence, he approached governance with surprising responsibility. He restored many of Nero's popular policies while distancing himself from the former emperor's excesses. He returned confiscated property, reinstated officials dismissed by Galba, and showed particular concern for maintaining public order in Rome. He even made a symbolic gesture toward constitutional governance by accepting the name of Nero, which the Senate had offered him, not out of admiration for the deceased emperor, but because it represented legitimacy to many ordinary citizens. These measured actions suggest that Otho might have developed into a capable ruler had circumstances allowed. The greatest challenge to Otho's rule emerged not from Rome, but from Germany, where Aulus Vitellius commanded powerful legions along the Rhine. Vitellius had been appointed governor of Lower Germany by Galba, ironically creating the very threat that would ultimately overthrow Otho. On January 1st, 69 CE, before Galba's assassination, the legions of Upper Germany had refused to swear allegiance to the emperor. On January 2nd, Vitellius's troops in Lower Germany proclaimed their commander emperor. 2 formidable generals, Aulus Caecina Alienus and Fabius Valens, marshalled their forces to support Vitellius and began marching toward Italy. The speed of these events suggests coordination. The German legions may have been acting in concert rather than spontaneously, raising questions about whether Vitellius had been actively plotting rebellion or was carried along by his ambitious subordinates. Otho faced this threat with considerable energy, attempting to negotiate with Vitellius while simultaneously preparing for war. He sent a letter offering to make Vitellius his son-in-law and share power, but these overtures were rejected. As Vitellian forces entered northern Italy, Otho gathered troops from the Praetorian Guard, urban cohorts, and legions recalled from Dalmatia and Pannonia. Several initial skirmishes favoured Otho's forces, boosting morale among his supporters. However, against the advice of several experienced generals who counselled delay, Otho decided to force a decisive battle at Bedriacum, near modern Cremona. This fateful decision resulted in a significant defeat for his forces on April 14, 69 CE. The aftermath of Bedriacum reveals Otho's most surprising quality, a sense of personal responsibility that transcended self-preservation. Though substantial forces remained loyal to him and many urged him to continue the fight, Otho chose a different path. According to Plutarch's detailed account, Otho told his supporters, "I consider this day more happy than that on which I first became emperor, knowing as I do what a fine spirit animates you, and being myself surrounded by such men. But do not rob me of a still greater happiness, that of making a noble end and of dying to save such fellow citizens." After writing farewell letters to his sister and to Messalina, Nero's widow whom he had planned to marry, he spent a quiet evening, drank some cold water, tested the sharpness of 2 daggers, and slept soundly. In the morning of April 16th, he thrust one dagger into his heart, ending his life and his 95-day reign. Plutarch's detailed narrative of Otho's final days presents us with one of history's more remarkable philosophical moments, an allegedly dissolute man discovering nobility in defeat. Otho's suicide stands in stark contrast to Nero's hesitant and fearful end, or Galba's helpless demise. By choosing death to prevent further bloodshed among Roman citizens, Otho displayed a sense of responsibility that has earned him surprising respect from ancient historians, otherwise inclined to criticize his character. Tacitus comments that Otho in death earned a measure of fame which he had not won in life, while Suetonius notes that he performed such a noble deed at the end that everyone was compelled to condemn the rest of his life more severely by comparison. This respect for an honourable end reflects Roman values regarding proper death. Choosing how to die represented a final exercise of freedom and self-determination. In Otho's case, his decision prevented further civil war, at least temporarily, making his suicide an act of political as well as personal significance. The victor at Bedriacum, Aulus Vitellius, presented yet another model of imperial leadership. Born around 15 CE to a family that had risen through imperial service rather than ancient nobility, Vitellius had built his career largely through personal connections rather than military or administrative talent. His father had held 3 consulships under Claudius and had been censor with the Emperor Claudius himself. The younger Vitellius carefully cultivated influential friendships, particularly with imperial freedmen who exercised considerable power under Claudius and Nero. He earned a reputation for flattery, reportedly being the first to worship Caligula as a god and encouraging Nero's theatrical ambitions. This combination of prestigious family connections and personal sycophancy earned him important appointments despite questions about his competence. Suetonius claims that Galba appointed him to command the Lower German legions precisely because he seemed harmless, a man of bottomless gluttony and correspondingly feeble ambition, supposedly incapable of causing trouble. Whether through personal ambition or the initiative of his subordinates, Vitellius found himself acclaimed emperor by his troops in January 69 CE. Rather than rushing to Rome himself, he dispatched his capable generals Caecina and Valens with substantial forces, while he followed at a more leisurely pace. After victory at Bedriacum and Otho's suicide, Vitellius continued his unhurried journey toward Rome, reportedly stopping for extravagant banquets and celebrations along the way. He visited the battlefield at Bedriacum weeks after the fighting, allegedly commenting that the body of a dead enemy always smells sweet, especially if he is a fellow citizen. Whether or not he actually made this callous remark, it captured the growing perception of Vitellius as a man lacking both decency and self-restraint. Vitellius entered Rome in July with a large military force, accepting the titles of Augustus and Pontifex Maximus from a compliant Senate. His early administrative actions showed some wisdom. He allowed Otho's officials to retain their positions, postponed trials for treason, and permitted the proper burial of Otho's remains. However, these promising beginnings quickly gave way to the behaviours that would define his brief reign. Ancient sources emphasize his extraordinary gluttony and expenditure on feasting. Suetonius claims he spent 900 million sesterces on dining during his 8-month reign, while Tacitus describes the lowest dregs of the arena and the stage and men of similar stamp, becoming his constant companions. While these accounts may exaggerate for rhetorical effect, archaeological evidence confirms unusual levels of luxury goods imported to Rome during this period, suggesting some basis for these criticisms. Beyond personal excess, Vitellius's most significant failure lay in his treatment of the troops who had brought him to power. The legions from Germany behaved with increasing lawlessness in Rome, treating the city as conquered territory rather than the capital they had ostensibly come to defend. Vitellius seemed unable or unwilling to impose discipline, creating growing resentment among Rome's population. Meanwhile, he disbanded the existing Praetorian Guard, replacing them with soldiers from his German legions and doubling their standard number, an expensive decision that nevertheless failed to create reliable support. Most dangerously, he appeared oblivious to growing opposition from the eastern provinces, where Titus Flavius Vespasian had been proclaimed emperor by his troops in Alexandria on July 1st, followed by the legions in Judea and Syria. As Vespasian's supporters, led by Marcus Antonius Primus commanding the Danube legions, marched toward Italy, Vitellius responded with indecision and vacillation. Initial skirmishes went badly for his forces, partly because his best generals, Caecina and Valens, were no longer effectively leading them. Caecina had actually attempted to defect to Vespasian, but was arrested by his own troops, while Valens was incapacitated by illness. In October 69 CE, a second battle of Bedriacum resulted in victory for Vespasian's forces. As they advanced toward Rome, Vitellius made increasingly desperate attempts to abdicate, offering to surrender power in exchange for his life. In a public ceremony, he even presented his dagger of office to the consul Caecilius Simplex, who refused to accept it. This pathetic scene was interrupted by angry supporters who forced Vitellius back to the imperial palace. Vitellius's end came amid confusion and violence when Vespasian's forces entered Rome on December 20th. Attempting to flee disguised in dirty clothes, the emperor was recognized, captured, and dragged through the streets with a rope around his neck. After public humiliation and torture, he was executed on the Gemonian stairs, a place traditionally reserved for the bodies of executed criminals. His final words, according to Suetonius, were, "Yet I was once your emperor," a poignant recognition of how completely his authority had evaporated. His body was thrown into the Tiber, and his brief reign of 8 months ended in complete disgrace. The rapid rise and fall of Vitellius offers a stark lesson in how character flaws undermine authority. While ancient sources may exaggerate his gluttony and weakness, his inability to control his troops, failure to prepare for obvious threats, and vacillation in crisis all suggest a man fundamentally unsuited to imperial leadership. His fate demonstrates that personal qualities, self-discipline, decisiveness and foresight, matter tremendously in rulers, particularly during unstable times. The contemptible nature of his death, humiliated, tortured and discarded, stands as the antithesis of Otho's dignified suicide, reinforcing Roman values regarding appropriate conduct even in defeat. With Vespasian's eventual triumph, the year of 4 emperors finally concluded, but its implications for Roman political understanding were profound and lasting. This traumatic period had exposed fundamental truths about imperial power that would shape governance for centuries to come. First and foremost, it revealed the crucial role of the legions in imperial politics. The Julio-Claudian Dynasty had maintained the fiction that the emperor's authority derived from constitutional powers granted by the Senate. The events of 68-69 CE demolished this pretense, demonstrating that real power lay with the army. Each of the 4 emperors had been proclaimed by troops, Galba in Spain, Otho by the Praetorians, Vitellius by the Rhine legions, and Vespasian by the eastern armies. The Senate merely ratified decisions made by men with military backing. This new reality would persist throughout imperial history, with soldiers increasingly aware of their power to make and unmake emperors. The year also highlighted growing tensions between provincial interests and Rome-centered politics. For the first time, emperors had emerged from the provinces rather than from the capital's political establishment. Galba governed Spain when proclaimed, Vitellius commanded in Germany, and Vespasian led forces in Judea. This shift reflected the growing importance of the provinces in imperial economics and politics. The empire was becoming less Rome-centred, a trend that would continue and accelerate in later centuries. Provincial elites increasingly participated in imperial governance, and emperors spent more time addressing provincial concerns rather than focusing exclusively on the capital. This evolution reflected the empire's maturation from a city-state with territories to a truly imperial system integrating diverse regions. Perhaps most significantly, the civil wars revealed the fundamental fragility of imperial control. What had appeared to be a stable system under the Julio-Claudians suddenly collapsed into chaos when the dynastic link was broken. The rapidity with which authority disappeared, armies turning against their commanders, officials changing allegiance, the Senate hastily recognizing each new claimant, demonstrated that imperial power rested on surprisingly fragile foundations of personal loyalty, perceived legitimacy, and practical effectiveness rather than institutional structures. Tacitus captures this revelation in the opening of his histories. I am entering upon the history of a period rich in disasters, terrible with battles, torn by civil struggles, horrible even in peace. His narrative examines not just what happened, but why the system proved so vulnerable to collapse. Tacitus's analysis of this period in his histories provides one of ancient literature's most penetrating examinations of political psychology and the nature of power. Writing several decades after the events, with the benefit of hindsight and sources no longer available to us, Tacitus explores how personal ambition, group psychology, and structural weaknesses combine to create crisis. He shows particular insight into the motivations of key figures, the role of rumour in shaping events, and the behaviour of crowds and armies. His famous assessment that the events of 68-69 CE divulged the secret of empire, that emperors could be made elsewhere than at Rome, identifies a fundamental transformation in Roman political understanding. Once this secret was revealed, it could never be forgotten, permanently altering how Romans conceived of imperial authority. The year of 4 emperors ultimately transformed the Roman political system by making explicit what had previously been implicit. Augustus had created an autocracy while maintaining republican appearances, what historians call the Principate, rule by the first citizen. After 69 CE, this fiction became harder to maintain. Vespasian and later emperors continued to observe constitutional forms, but everyone now understood that imperial power rested primarily on military support. This recognition changed how emperors behaved, how the Senate related to them, and how provincials understood their place in the system. Civil war had stripped away comforting illusions about constitutional governance, revealing the raw mechanisms of power beneath. This transformation did not immediately create a naked military autocracy, that would come later, but it fundamentally altered the psychological foundations of imperial rule. The ultimate philosophical lesson of this turbulent year concerns how civil conflict transforms political systems. Civil wars are particularly revealing moments in political history because they expose the fundamental structures of power normally hidden beneath everyday governance. When Romans fought Romans for control of the state, they were forced to articulate what legitimized imperial rule, where authority truly resided, and what qualities an emperor required. The answers revealed by these conflicts, that power rested primarily with the military, that provincial interests mattered alongside Rome's, that personal character significantly affected imperial success, would shape Roman governance for centuries to come. What emerged from the ashes of the Civil War was not a new constitutional structure, but a new understanding of the existing structure, a psychological transformation as significant as any formal change in governance. The year of 4 emperors thus stands as one of history's most illuminating case studies in how crisis reveals political reality, stripping away comforting fictions to expose the true nature of power. The Flavian Dynasty emerged from the chaos of civil war to establish a new imperial foundation. bringing stability to a Roman world shaken by the rapid succession of 4 emperors in a single year. This remarkable family, Vespasian and his sons Titus and Domitian, would rule Rome for 27 years, healing the wounds of civil conflict while fundamentally transforming the nature of imperial authority. Unlike the aristocratic Julio-Claudians, who traced their legitimacy to divine descent and connection to Augustus, the Flavians came from relatively humble origins, creating a new model of leadership based on competence, practical experience, and familial succession. Their reign represents a crucial period of transition when the Roman Empire regained its footing and developed new institutional structures that would sustain it for centuries to come. The story of the Flavians illustrates how new leadership can revitalize failing systems, but also how power tends to corrupt even the most promising beginnings. Titus Flavius Vespasianus, the dynasty's founder, was born in 9 CE in a small Sabine village northeast of Rome, far from the centers of power and privilege. His father had been a tax collector and minor official, while his mother came from a more prominent family, though still not from the highest ranks of Roman society. This modest background stood in stark contrast to his imperial predecessors, all of whom had connections to the highest echelons of Roman aristocracy. The young Vespasian pursued a military career, serving in Thrace and later as a legion commander in the invasion of Britain under Claudius in 43 CE. His performance earned him triumphal decorations and steadily increasing responsibilities. Under Nero, he governed Africa as proconsul, where he earned a reputation for integrity, though Suetonius notes that he returned from this normally lucrative post no richer than when he began, forcing him to mortgage his estates and turn to mule trading to restore his finances. This financial struggle, unusual in an age when provincial governors typically enriched themselves, suggests either remarkable honesty or poor administrative skills. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Vespasian was generally honest by Roman standards, but not so principled as to reject all opportunities for personal gain. Vespasian's breakthrough came when Nero appointed him to command the suppression of the Jewish revolt that had erupted in Judea in 66 CE. This assignment was both an opportunity and a risk. Success would bring glory, but failure could be fatal in Nero's increasingly paranoid regime. He approached the campaign methodically, first securing the Galilee region before gradually closing in on Jerusalem. By 69 CE, with most of Judea under Roman control, Jerusalem remained the final significant center of resistance. It was during this campaign that news arrived of Nero's suicide and the subsequent chaos in Rome. As Galba, Otho, and Vitellius rapidly succeeded one another as emperor, Vespasian maintained a cautious neutrality, continuing his military operations while carefully monitoring the political situation. This patience, waiting for the right moment rather than rushing to declare himself, characterizes Vespasian's practical approach to power. The decision to claim the purple came only after careful preparation. On July 1, 69 CE, the legions in Alexandria proclaimed Vespasian emperor, followed 2 days later by his own troops in Judea. This coordinated announcement suggests considerable behind-the-scenes planning. Key to his success was the support of Gaius Licinius Mucianus, governor of Syria, who set aside personal rivalry to back Vespasian's bid, and Tiberius Alexander, prefect of Egypt, who controlled Rome's vital grain supply. While Vespasian remained in Alexandria, securing resources and support, his supporters moved quickly. Mucianus led forces toward Rome, while Vespasian's most energetic backer, Marcus Antonius Primus, commander of the Danube legions, moved swiftly into northern Italy without waiting for orders. After defeating Vitellius's forces at the Second Battle of Bedriacum, Antonius Primus captured Rome in December 69, ending Vitellius's brief reign. Vespasian himself entered Rome only in October 70 CE, nearly a year after being proclaimed emperor, a delay that demonstrates his careful, methodical approach to consolidating power. Upon assuming control of the empire, Vespasian faced enormous challenges. The treasury was empty after years of Neronian extravagance, followed by civil war. Military discipline had deteriorated as legions realized their power to make and unmake emperors. The physical fabric of Rome itself required restoration following the Great Fire of 64 CE and subsequent civil conflict. Perhaps most significantly, the imperial system needed rebuilding after the rapid collapse of four successive regimes had undermined its legitimacy. Vespasian approached these daunting tasks with the same practical, methodical attitude that had characterized his military career. Financial reform became Vespasian's most urgent priority. The historian Suetonius claims that Vespasian estimated he needed 40 billion sesterces to restore the state to solvency, an enormous sum that required creative measures to acquire. He increased existing taxes, restored taxes Galba had cancelled, imposed new levies on unusual items including urine collected from public toilets, leading to the famous phrase, "money doesn't stink," when his son Titus objected to the unsavoury source, and eliminated tax exemptions granted to various Greek cities. He reclaimed public lands that had been illegally occupied, pursued those who had failed to pay taxes under previous administrations, and sold offices and imperial favours more openly than his predecessors. These measures earned him a reputation for greed, a criticism he partly neutralised through self-deprecating humour about his humble origins and focus on money. When approached by an engineer offering a device to transport heavy columns inexpensively, Vespasian reportedly rewarded the man but refused to implement the technology, saying, "You must let me feed my poor commons." This anecdote, whether literal truth or illustrative fiction, captures Vespasian's philosophy of governance. Practical concerns, like employment for common people, outweighed abstract efficiency. The restoration of Rome's physical infrastructure proceeded alongside financial recovery. Vespasian launched an extensive building program that served multiple purposes, employing thousands of citizens, demonstrating imperial magnificence and erasing the damage from Nero's era. The most famous Flavian construction, the Colosseum, officially the Flavian Amphitheatre, was strategically built on the site of a lake in Nero's excessively grand Golden House, symbolically returning to the people land that Nero had appropriated for personal use. This massive structure, funded largely by treasure captured during the Jewish War, could seat approximately 50,000 spectators for gladiatorial combat and other spectacles. Beyond symbolism, the Colosseum created thousands of jobs and cemented the connection between the emperor and popular entertainment. Vespasian also restored the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, damaged during civil conflict, built the Temple of Peace and completed the Temple of the Divine Claudius, which Nero had abandoned. These projects combined religious piety, employment programs, and political messaging, a characteristic Flavian blend of practical and symbolic objectives. Vespasian's approach to imperial authority differed markedly from the Julio-Claudian model. Lacking divine ancestry or connection to Augustus, he emphasized competence, accessibility, and ordinary virtues rather than mystical legitimacy. He maintained a simple lifestyle by imperial standards, rising early to conduct business, making himself available to citizens, and often joking about his humble origins. When courtiers attempted to fabricate a prestigious ancestry for him, linking the Flavians to the founders of Rheata, he reportedly laughed and dismissed their efforts. This self-deprecating style disarmed critics and created a new model of imperial leadership based on merit rather than birth. At the same time, Vespasian clearly recognized the importance of establishing a dynasty. He placed his sons Titus and Domitian in positions of authority, had the Senate formally recognize them as heirs, and included their images on coinage and monuments. This transparent approach to succession, openly acknowledging his intention to found a dynasty rather than maintaining the Augustan fiction of constitutional authority, represents another Flavian innovation that brought imperial reality more closely into alignment with practice. The completion of the Jewish War stands as one of the defining events of Vespasian's reign. After his elevation to emperor, Vespasian delegated command of the Judean campaign to his son Titus, who captured Jerusalem in August 70 CE after a brutal 5-month siege. The consequences were catastrophic for the Jewish population. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, who had been captured by Vespasian earlier in the war and subsequently joined the Roman cause. Over 1 million people died during the siege from starvation, disease and combat. The Temple of Jerusalem, the central institution of Jewish religious life, was destroyed despite Titus's reported orders to preserve it. Thousands of captives were executed or sold into slavery, with others sent to Rome to march in Vespasian and Titus's joint triumph in 71 CE. The sacred treasures of the temple, including the menorah, were displayed in the triumphal procession and their images later carved on the Arch of Titus, where they remain visible today. This devastating conclusion to the Jewish revolt fundamentally altered the course of Jewish history, eliminating the temple cult and accelerating the development of rabbinic Judaism centered on Torah study rather than temple sacrifice. From the Roman perspective, the victory demonstrated Flavian military prowess and provided both treasure and legitimacy for the new dynasty. The special tax imposed on Jews throughout the empire, the Fiscus Judaicus, served both as punishment and as an ongoing reminder of Flavian authority. Vespasian's decade of rule brought remarkable stability to an empire that had seemed on the verge of disintegration. His pragmatic approach to governance, focusing on financial solvency, military discipline and administrative efficiency rather than grand ideological projects, proved exactly what Rome needed after the excesses of Nero and the chaos of civil war. When he died on June 23, 79 CE, reportedly joking with his characteristic humour, "Dear me, I think I'm becoming a god," he left behind a restored imperial system and a clear succession. The contrast between Vespasian's practical approach and the more idealistic or self-indulgent tendencies of other emperors raises profound questions about governance. Is pragmatism ultimately more beneficial than idealism in leadership? Does effective rule require setting aside grander visions in favour of addressing fundamental concerns like financial stability and basic security? Vespasian's success suggests that in times of crisis, practical competence may matter more than inspiring vision or philosophical principle. Yet his willingness to compromise, selling offices, imposing harsh taxes, brutally suppressing the Jewish revolt, illustrates the moral costs that often accompany pragmatic governance. The philosophical tension between idealistic aspirations and practical necessities remains a fundamental challenge for all political systems, one that the Flavian dynasty navigated with remarkable, if sometimes troubling, success. Titus Flavius Vespasianus, commonly known simply as Titus, succeeded to the purple upon his father's death in 79 CE, becoming the first Roman emperor to follow his biological father on the throne without adoption. Born in 39 CE, Titus had received extensive preparation for imperial responsibility. Unlike many imperial heirs raised in the sheltered environment of the palace, he grew up before his father's elevation, experiencing a more typical Roman aristocratic education. He developed particularly close ties with Britannicus, the son of Emperor Claudius, and was present at the banquet where Britannicus was reportedly poisoned by Nero, a traumatic experience that may have shaped his later caution regarding court politics. During his father's reign, Titus served as Praetorian prefect, supervised the intelligence service, and acted as virtual co-ruler, drafting correspondence and edicts in Vespasian's name. Most significantly, he commanded the final phase of the Jewish war, capturing Jerusalem and displaying the military leadership Romans expected from their emperors. This extensive preparation, combined with his natural abilities, made the transition of power remarkably smooth, a striking contrast to the chaos that had followed Nero's death a decade earlier. Despite his thorough preparation, Titus faced considerable concerns about his character when he assumed power. During his father's reign, he had developed a reputation for extravagance and questionable companions. His romantic relationship with the Jewish princess Berenice, sister of Herod Agrippa II, provoked particular criticism, both because of her foreign origin and the echoes of Mark Antony's relationship with Cleopatra a century earlier. He was also known for participating in late-night revels with companions of dubious character. Suetonius reports that many expected him to become another Nero based on these behaviours. Yet upon becoming emperor, Titus displayed unexpected restraint and responsibility, sending Berenice away despite their mutual attachment and distancing himself from his previous companions. This transformation from apparently self-indulgent prince to responsible emperor earned him particular praise from ancient historians accustomed to seeing power corrupt rather than ennoble its holders. Titus's brief reign was dominated by response to disasters rather than proactive policy initiatives. Within months of his accession, Mount Vesuvius erupted on August 24, 79 CE, destroying the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum and causing widespread devastation throughout the Bay of Naples region. The eruption ranks among antiquity's most dramatic natural disasters, killing thousands instantly and displacing many more. The following year, a major fire swept through Rome, damaging the newly restored capital, the Temple of Jupiter, and other significant structures. A severe plague followed these disasters, creating a sense of divine displeasure that required imperial response. Titus reacted to these calamities with remarkable energy and generosity. He donated imperial property to aid victims, personally supervised relief efforts following the Vesuvius eruption, and implemented extensive rebuilding programs. These disasters, while devastating, provided Titus the opportunity to demonstrate imperial concern for the populace, a fundamental aspect of the ruler's role in Roman political thinking. His response burnished his reputation for compassion, captured in his famous lament upon remembering a day without performing a good deed. "Friends, I have lost a day." The archaeological evidence from Pompeii and Herculaneum provides an extraordinary window into Roman life at the precise moment of the Vesuvian eruption, preserving details that would otherwise have been lost to history. Unlike most ancient sites that experienced gradual abandonment and deterioration, these cities were instantly entombed in volcanic ash and pumice, preserving buildings, artifacts, and even human remains in their final positions. The excavations, beginning in the 18th century and continuing to the present day, have revealed intimate details of daily life. Taverns with customers' orders still chalked on walls, laundries with garments still soaking, kitchens with meals in preparation. Particularly poignant are the plaster casts of victims, created by pouring plaster into the voids left by decomposed bodies, revealing their final postures as they succumb to the toxic gases and ash. Beyond these dramatic human elements, the sites provide invaluable information about urban planning, architecture, art, commerce, and social organization during the early imperial period. Wall paintings, mosaics, and graffiti offer insights into everything from religious practices to sexual attitudes, political opinions to commercial advertisements. These archaeological treasures, tragic as their origin may be, have enormously enriched our understanding of Roman society during the Flavian period. Titus's building projects continued his father's program of imperial magnificence combined with public benefit. He completed and dedicated the Colosseum, though several of its features were actually finalized under Domitian. The inaugural games in 80 CE lasted 100 days and featured gladiatorial combats, wild beast hunts, mock naval battles, and various spectacles designed to awe the Roman populace while associating the Flavian dynasty with public entertainment. Titus also built magnificent public baths on the site of Nero's Golden House, further emphasizing the Flavian claim to have returned to the people what Nero had appropriated for personal luxury. These baths introduced innovations in heating and water management while providing a space for Romans of various social classes to mingle in relative equality, though areas remained segregated by gender and some facilities were reserved for higher status visitors. Like his father, Titus understood the importance of combining practical public benefits with visible displays of imperial generosity and power. Titus died unexpectedly on September 13, 81 CE, after a reign of barely 26 months. The precise cause remains uncertain. Ancient sources suggest fever, possibly exacerbated by bathing in too cold water during an illness. His death reportedly occurred at the same villa where his brother Domitian may have hastened the end of their father, leading some ancient sources to imply fraternal foul play. though most modern historians dismiss these suspicions as later inventions designed to blacken Domitian's reputation. Whatever the cause, Titus's early death at age 41 prompted genuine public mourning. Suetonius describes it as similar to a family bereavement rather than a public occasion, while Cassius Dio claims the Roman people mourned deeply over him, even though they had not been particularly pleased with some of his acts. This popular affection reflects both his effective disaster response and personal charisma. The Senate promptly deified him, continuing the pattern established with Augustus, where popular emperors became gods after death. The brevity of Titus's reign creates a particular historical challenge. It appears so successful that we naturally wonder what might have developed had he lived longer. Would he have maintained his restraint and public focus, or gradually succumbed to the corrupting influence of absolute power? Would the apparently harmonious relationship with his brother Domitian have deteriorated as tensions over policy and influence emerged? These unanswerable questions highlight a profound philosophical issue: how to evaluate potential that remains unfulfilled. Ancient writers, particularly those hostile to his brother and successor Domitian, had strong incentives to idealize Titus as a contrast. Pliny the Younger explicitly makes this comparison, suggesting the gods took Titus early to prevent the world having an emperor too good for it. This idealization of lost potential appears repeatedly throughout history, from Alexander the Great to John F. Kennedy, reflecting humanity's tendency to imagine perfect outcomes for paths not taken. The tragedy of unfulfilled potential thus becomes a canvas on which later generations project their desires and disappointments, often telling us more about the writers than their subjects. In Titus's case, his brief excellence remains tantalizing but ultimately unknowable in its full dimensions. The succession passed smoothly to Titus Flavius Domitianus, known as Domitian, the younger son of Vespasian, born in 51 CE. Unlike his brother, Domitian had received limited preparation for imperial responsibility. While Titus accompanied their father on the Judean campaign, Domitian remained in Rome during the civil war, reportedly living in relative poverty until the Flavian forces captured the city. Though Vespasian and Titus included him in imperial honours, granting him the title of Caesar, placing his image on coinage and having him hold numerous consulships, they apparently restricted his actual authority. This limited experience may help explain the striking contrast between his administrative competence and political tone-deafness once he assumed power. Domitian's 15-year reign would prove the longest of the Flavian Dynasty, a period marked by effective governance, increasingly overshadowed by autocratic tendencies and deteriorating relationships with the senatorial elite. As emperor, Domitian displayed remarkable administrative talent, particularly in financial management, provincial governance, and military affairs. He maintained his father's fiscal discipline while reducing some tax burdens, standardized weights and measures to prevent commercial fraud, and carefully supervised provincial governors to prevent corruption. His attention to detail became legendary. Suetonius reports that he personally reviewed all important cases and frequently intervened to ensure fair verdicts, while Frontinus, superintendent of Rome's aqueducts, praises Domitian's careful protection of public water resources. Domitian also devoted considerable attention to border security, strengthening frontiers with stone fortifications, establishing permanent camps in troublesome regions, and maintaining military discipline. In Britain, his general Agricola, father-in-law of the historian Tacitus, consolidated Roman control in Scotland and possibly circumnavigated the island, though Domitian later recalled him, either from jealousy as Tacitus claims or more likely due to legitimate military needs elsewhere. On the Danube frontier, Domitian personally led campaigns against the Chatti and Dacians, eventually stabilizing the region after initial setbacks by establishing client buffer states. These administrative and military accomplishments demonstrate genuine competence often overlooked, in accounts focusing on his more controversial personal conduct. Domitian's relationship with the Senate represents the most problematic aspect of his reign. Unlike his father and brother, who maintained the elaborate fiction of partnership with the senatorial class, Domitian made little effort to disguise the reality of imperial autocracy. He insisted on the title Lord and God, Dominus et Deus, in court communications, required extremely formal etiquette from senators, and made key decisions without senatorial consultation. He also claimed the office of perpetual censor, giving him official authority to review senatorial membership and moral conduct, powers previous emperors had exercised without formal title. While these changes primarily formalized existing realities rather than creating new authorities, they stripped away the comforting republican facade the Senate cherished. Domitian further antagonized senators by advancing equestrians, the commercial class, and competent non-Italians to important positions, threatening traditional senatorial monopoly on high office. These policies, while arguably modernizing the imperial administration, created implacable enemies among the very class responsible for recording his historical reputation. Cultural and religious policy under Domitian combined traditional Roman conservatism with creative innovation. He strictly enforced the Augustan moral legislation concerning adultery and restored numerous temples, positioning himself as defender of traditional Roman values. At the same time, he promoted the Egyptian goddess Isis, established a temple to the Flavian family, including his deified father and brother, and increasingly associated himself with Nerva, whom he considered his divine patroness. He celebrated the secular games in 88 CE, a rare religious festival supposedly occurring only once every 110 years, which Augustus had previously used to mark a new golden age. This combination of traditionalism and innovation characterizes much of Domitian's approach, maintaining established forms while subtly redirecting their meaning towards support for increasingly centralized imperial authority. Literary culture under Domitian presents a complex picture. Ancient sources emphasize his expulsion of philosophers from Rome and prosecution of writers perceived as critical of the regime. The poet Juvenal describes an atmosphere where writers feared addressing contemporary issues, focusing instead on safely distant historical topics. Yet paradoxically, Domitian also actively patronized literature, establishing literary competitions, rebuilding Rome's libraries after fire damage, and supporting poets like Martial and Statius, who produced works celebrating his achievements. Statius's relationship with Domitian particularly illuminates this complexity. His epic Thebaid avoids directly political themes, yet his collection Silvae contains elaborate praise poems for the emperor and descriptions of imperial banquets and buildings. These poems blend genuine admiration for Domitian's architectural achievements with carefully calibrated flattery, suggesting a literary environment where talent could flourish within established boundaries rather than one of simple repression. This nuanced picture challenges simplistic portrayals of Domitian as uniformly hostile to cultural expression. The latter years of Domitian's reign saw increasing paranoia and repression. Following the revolt of Saturninus, governor of Upper Germany, in 89 CE, Domitian intensified prosecutions for treason, executing several senators and confiscating their property. Whether these represented genuine plots or merely pretexts remains debated. Our primary sources come from senatorial historians with clear biases against Domitian. Regardless of their justice, these prosecutions created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that poisoned the relationship between emperor and elite. Suetonius portrays Domitian in his final years as isolated and fearful, lining his palace colonnades with reflective stone to see who approached from behind and interrogating prisoners with his own hands. While likely exaggerated, these accounts suggest genuine deterioration in the political climate as Domitian's reign progressed. Domitian's assassination on September 18, 96 CE resulted from a palace conspiracy involving his wife Domitia Longina, court officials, and the Praetorian Guard. According to Suetonius, the emperor's chamberlain Parthenius orchestrated the plot, with the actual killing performed by a steward named Stephanus, who had concealed a dagger in a bandaged arm. Domitian, reportedly paranoid about potential assassination, nevertheless failed to prevent the attack in his own bedroom. Following his death, the Senate ordered his name chiseled from monuments, damnatio memoriae, his statues destroyed, and his acts officially rescinded. This formal condemnation, combined with the hostile accounts of senatorial historians like Tacitus and Pliny the Younger, cemented Domitian's historical reputation as a tyrant despite his administrative accomplishments. The conspiracy that ended his life had apparently coordinated with Marcus Aurelius Nerva, an elderly senator who immediately succeeded to the purple, beginning what history would call the Five Good Emperors era. Domitian's reign raises profound questions about the relationship between governance and freedom. By most objective measures, his administration provided efficient government, border security, sound finances and public works that benefited ordinary citizens. Yet he systematically undermined political freedom for the elite, established increasingly authoritarian practices, and created an atmosphere where criticism became dangerous. This tension between effective administration and political liberty recurs throughout history. Authoritarian systems often deliver practical benefits while sacrificing freedom of expression and political participation. The Roman case is particularly instructive because the victims of Domitian's authoritarianism, the senatorial class, controlled the historical narrative, ensuring his practical achievements would be overshadowed by his political repression. This dynamic reminds us that history often reflects power relationships in its telling and retelling, privileging certain perspectives while marginalizing others. The challenge for modern analysis lies in acknowledging both Domitian's genuine administrative talents and the legitimate grievances of those who suffered under his increasingly paranoid rule. The Flavian dynasty's brief 27-year span fundamentally transformed the Roman imperial system. Emerging from civil war and humble origins, they established new foundations for imperial authority based on competence, practical governance, and open dynastic succession rather than connections to Augustus or divine ancestry. Their building programs physically reshaped Rome, providing infrastructure and entertainment venues that would serve for centuries. Their administrative reforms modernized governance, incorporating previously marginalized groups into imperial service and standardizing provincial administration. Above all, they restored stability to a system shaken by Nero's excesses and subsequent civil war, demonstrating that the empire could survive the fall of its founding dynasty. Yet the Flavians also accelerated the transition toward more open autocracy, particularly under Domitian, establishing precedents that would ultimately transform the Principate into the more overtly monarchical dominate of later centuries. In this tension between practical achievement and authoritarian tendency lies perhaps their most significant legacy, a demonstration that effective governance often comes at the cost of political freedom, a trade-off that continues to challenge political systems to the present day. The period from 96 to 180 CE stands as the zenith of Roman imperial achievement, a remarkable era when 5 exceptional emperors transformed the Roman Empire into the ancient world's most prosperous and well-governed state. This golden age represents something unprecedented in human political history, nearly a century of competent, conscientious leadership that brought peace, prosperity and cultural flowering to tens of millions of people across 3 continents. What makes this period even more remarkable is that it emerged not from hereditary succession but from a deliberate system of adoption where each emperor chose his successor based on merit rather than blood relation. The 5 good emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius, created a model of enlightened governance that has inspired political thinkers for 2 millennia, demonstrating that autocratic power, when wielded by individuals of exceptional character and intelligence, could serve the common good more effectively than any alternative system available in the ancient world. Marcus Aurelius Nerva emerged as emperor from the most unlikely circumstances, selected by the Senate in 96 CE following the assassination of the despotic Domitian. Born around 30 CE into an established senatorial family, Nerva had spent his entire career in civilian service, serving as praetor under Nero and consul twice, first under Vespasian and again under Domitian. Unlike the military commanders who had dominated imperial succession since the year of 4 emperors, Nerva represented a return to civilian governance and traditional senatorial values. His selection was remarkable not only for his age, he was 66 when proclaimed emperor, but for the manner of his elevation. Rather than being thrust forward by ambitious generals or proclaimed by restless legions, Nerva was chosen by the Senate itself, in what appears to have been a genuine attempt to restore constitutional government. This unusual process reflected the senators' exhaustion with Domitian's paranoid tyranny and their desire for a return to the collaborative governance that had characterized the early principate under Augustus. The circumstances of Nerva's accession reveal both the possibilities and limitations of senatorial authority in the imperial system. Domitian's assassination had been carried out by court officials rather than military commanders, creating an unusual power vacuum in which the Senate could act decisively. Yet even as they selected one of their own as emperor, the senators understood that their choice would need military validation to survive. Nerva's early months were marked by careful reconciliation efforts, pardoning political exiles, ending treason trials, and restoring properties confiscated under Domitian. He established a precedent that would influence all his successors by refusing to execute senators, declaring that no senator would die during his reign. This policy of clemency extended to many who had served Domitian faithfully, recognizing that effective governance required incorporating existing administrative talent rather than conducting wholesale purges. The new emperor also instituted significant financial reforms, establishing alimentary programs to support poor children and selling imperial property to reduce expenses, demonstrating fiscal responsibility that contrasted sharply with Domitian's extravagance. However, Nerva's civilian background proved problematic when dealing with the Praetorian Guard, who remained loyal to Domitian's memory and suspicious of the senatorial government. In October 97 CE, the Guard surrounded the imperial palace and demanded the execution of Domitian's assassins. Faced with this military pressure, Nerva was forced to comply, highlighting the fundamental dependence of imperial authority on military support. This humiliation demonstrated that despite the Senate's role in his selection, the emperor's actual power still rested on the soldiers' acceptance. The incident convinced Nerva that he needed a successor with military credentials, leading to his most significant political decision, the adoption of Marcus Ulpius Traianus, known to history as Trajan, who commanded the powerful Rhine legions and enjoyed universal respect among the troops. The adoption of Trajan in October 97 CE established a precedent that would define the next century of imperial succession. Rather than relying on biological heirs, Nerva chose his successor based on merit, selecting the individual best qualified to continue effective governance. This decision required considerable political courage, as it essentially acknowledged that Nerva himself was a transitional figure whose primary achievement would be the peaceful transfer of power to a more capable successor. Trajan was not merely adopted as son and heir, but was also granted imperium and tribunician power, making him co-emperor and ensuring a smooth transition. When Nerva died peacefully in January 98 CE, Trajan automatically became sole emperor without crisis or opposition, validating the wisdom of planned succession. This model would be followed by each subsequent good emperor, creating unprecedented stability in imperial leadership. The philosophical implications of this adoptive succession system deserve careful consideration, as it represents one of history's most successful experiments in meritocratic governance. Traditional hereditary monarchy assumes that leadership qualities pass through bloodlines, while republican systems typically rely on competitive elections to select leaders. The adoptive system pioneered by Nerva offered a third alternative: having an experienced ruler choose his successor based on demonstrated competence and character. This approach avoided both the lottery of genetic inheritance and the divisiveness of electoral competition, while ensuring that imperial power passed to individuals with proven administrative and military capabilities. The system worked remarkably well because each emperor took seriously his responsibility to identify and prepare a worthy successor, understanding that his own legacy depended largely on his successor's performance. This created powerful incentives for responsible choice while allowing for the careful grooming of future leaders. Marcus Ulpius Traianus represented the fulfillment of imperial potential in ways that even Augustus might not have imagined. Born around 53 CE in Italica, Spain, he was the first emperor born outside Italy, symbolizing the empire's evolution from a city-state with territories to a genuinely international system. His father had served with distinction under Vespasian, and Trajan himself had built an impressive military career, commanding legions in Spain, Syria, and Germany before his appointment to the Rhine frontier. Unlike previous emperors who had inherited power young or been thrust into leadership by circumstance, Trajan was 45 when he became emperor, with decades of administrative and military experience behind him. This background proved invaluable as he approached imperial responsibilities with practical wisdom rather than theoretical knowledge. His Spanish origins also gave him a different perspective on imperial governance, understanding viscerally that the empire's strength lay not in the dominance of Rome over its territories, but in the integration of diverse peoples under Roman law and administration. Trajan's personality combined qualities that had rarely been found together in previous emperors. Ancient sources consistently describe him as approachable and unpretentious, willing to engage with senators as colleagues rather than subjects. Unlike Domitian, who had insisted on divine honours, Trajan maintained the fiction of republican equality, consulting the Senate on important matters and treating them with genuine respect. Yet this accessibility never compromised his authority or effectiveness. He possessed remarkable energy, personally leading armies in the field and involving himself in administrative details throughout the empire. The historian Cassius Dio, writing a century later, captured this balance perfectly by noting that Trajan was most aristocratic and most democratic, most stately and most simple. This combination of qualities made him beloved by all classes of Roman society. The Senate appreciated his respect for their dignity, the army admired his military prowess, and the common people benefited from his generous public programs. The Dacian Wars, fought between 101, 102 and 105, 106 CE, established Trajan's reputation as Rome's greatest military emperor since Julius Caesar. Dacia, roughly corresponding to modern Romania, was ruled by King Decebalus, who had previously forced Domitian into a humiliating treaty that included annual tribute payments. For Trajan, this arrangement was intolerable, both financially and diplomatically, representing a stain on Roman honour that demanded correction. The first campaign successfully established Roman dominance, but Decebalus's continued resistance necessitated a second war that resulted in his suicide and Dacia's complete conquest. The wealth seized from Dacian gold mines was staggering, estimated at over £650,000 of gold and twice that amount in silver, providing resources that would fund Trajan's building programs and social welfare initiatives for decades. More significantly, the conquest provided land for Roman colonization, eventually creating one of the empire's most thoroughly Romanized provinces. The integration of Dacia demonstrates Trajan's sophisticated understanding of imperial expansion. Conquest was only the beginning of a longer process of cultural and economic integration that strengthened the empire as a whole. Trajan's eastern campaigns between 113, 117 CE represent both the pinnacle and the potential limitations of Roman imperial expansion. Motivated by long-standing tensions with Parthia over Armenia's status and perhaps by personal ambition to surpass Alexander the Great's conquests, Trajan launched a massive invasion that initially achieved stunning success. His forces occupied Armenia, Mesopotamia, and briefly reached the Persian Gulf, bringing the Roman Empire to its greatest territorial extent. Yet these conquests proved difficult to consolidate, facing constant rebellion and requiring enormous resources to maintain. When Trajan died suddenly in 117 CE, while returning from the east, his successor Hadrian immediately abandoned most of these territorial gains, recognizing that they extended Roman power beyond sustainable limits. This decision sparked historical debate about Trajan's judgment in his final years. Was the eastern expansion a necessary response to Parthian aggression or an expensive exercise in personal vanity? The evidence suggests a complex mixture of strategic and personal motivations, highlighting the tension between an emperor's individual ambitions and the empire's collective interests. The domestic achievements of Trajan's reign arguably exceeded even his military conquests in their lasting significance. His building program transformed Rome itself, creating the Forum of Trajan with its magnificent column, the markets of Trajan, possibly the world's first shopping mall, and the Baths of Trajan, which established the architectural template for later imperial bath complexes. These projects served multiple purposes, providing employment during construction, offering public amenities for Rome's population, and creating lasting monuments to imperial generosity. The alimentary system he established represented revolutionary social policy, providing regular food distributions to poor children throughout Italy. This program, funded by imperial loans to landowners with property as security, created a sustainable welfare system that supported thousands of families while strengthening local economies. Archaeological evidence suggests the alimentary system operated effectively for over a century, demonstrating the practical wisdom behind Trajan's social policies. Trajan's column, completed around 113 CE, deserves particular attention as one of history's most sophisticated examples of political art. Rising 125 feet into the Roman sky, the column's spiral frieze depicts the Dacian Wars in extraordinary detail, showing over 2,500 human figures in 155 separate scenes. This artistic narrative serves multiple functions simultaneously, commemorating Trajan's military achievements, educating viewers about the geography and peoples of Dacia, demonstrating Roman military superiority, and providing a model for how imperial conquest should be conducted. The column's artistic program shows Romans not as brutal conquerors, but as disciplined soldiers bringing civilization to barbarian lands. Trajan himself appears repeatedly as an ideal commander, brave in battle, merciful to defeated enemies, concerned for his troops' welfare. This carefully crafted image influenced how Romans understood their emperor and their empire's mission. The column also housed Trajan's ashes after his death, making it simultaneously a war memorial, artistic achievement, and imperial mausoleum. The ethical dimensions of imperial expansion under Trajan raise profound philosophical questions that resonate across the centuries. From a Roman perspective, conquest served civilization by extending law, order, and prosperity to peoples previously divided by tribal warfare and primitive customs. Roman expansion brought roads, aqueducts, theatres, and forums to regions that had never known such amenities. It created opportunities for local elites to participate in imperial governance, while providing security against barbarian raids. The integration of conquered peoples as Roman citizens offered unprecedented social mobility in the ancient world. Yet conquest also involved enormous human costs, death, enslavement and cultural destruction for those who resisted Roman rule. Modern historians estimate that Trajan's Dacian Wars resulted in hundreds of thousands of casualties, and the enslavement of comparable numbers. The question of whether these costs were justified by the benefits of Roman civilization has no simple answer, reflecting fundamental tensions in how we evaluate historical achievement and moral responsibility. Publius Aelius Hadrianus ascended to imperial power in circumstances that demonstrated both the strengths and potential weaknesses of the adoptive succession system. Born in 76 CE in the same Spanish town as Trajan, Hadrian had been groomed for leadership through a carefully planned career combining military service, administrative experience, and cultural education. He served as quaestor, praetor, and consul, while commanding legions in Pannonia and governing Syria. His relationship with Trajan was complex. They were related through marriage, and Hadrian had been part of the emperor's inner circle during the Dacian Wars. Yet Trajan's adoption of Hadrian as his successor was announced only on his deathbed, possibly by Trajan's wife Plotina, rather than the emperor himself. This ambiguity created brief uncertainty about the succession's legitimacy, resolved only when Hadrian received the army's acclamation and the Senate's recognition. The episode highlights how the adoptive system, while generally successful, still depended on clear communication and acceptance by key power centers. Hadrian's personality and interest differed markedly from his predecessors, reflecting the adaptability of the imperial system to leaders with varying talents and priorities. While Trajan had been primarily a military commander and builder, Hadrian was essentially an intellectual, a poet, architect, philosopher, and passionate devotee of Greek culture. His education had been thoroughly cosmopolitan, studying in Athens and travelling extensively before becoming emperor. This background shaped his approach to imperial governance, emphasizing cultural integration over military expansion and personal inspection over delegation. Ancient sources describe him as restlessly curious, possessing an almost compulsive need to see and understand every aspect of his vast domain. This intellectual approach to leadership represented something new in Roman imperial history, an emperor who viewed governance as an intellectual challenge requiring comprehensive knowledge rather than simply military dominance and administrative competence. The most dramatic early decision of Hadrian's reign was his withdrawal from Trajan's eastern conquests, a choice that required considerable political courage given the military and financial resources invested in those territories. Hadrian recognized that the eastern provinces were strategically indefensible and economically unprofitable, requiring constant military intervention to maintain control. By abandoning Mesopotamia and Armenia while retaining only areas that could be realistically defended, he demonstrated strategic wisdom that prioritized long-term imperial interests over short-term prestige. This decision was not universally popular. Many Romans viewed it as abandoning Trajan's legacy, but subsequent events validated Hadrian's judgment. The resources freed by this withdrawal were redirected towards strengthening defensible frontiers and improving provincial administration, policies that proved far more beneficial to the empire's long-term health than attempting to hold distant territories. Hadrian's travels throughout the empire between 121, 125 and 128, 134 CE represent an unprecedented experiment in imperial governance, demonstrating a radically different conception of how emperors should relate to their subjects. Previous emperors had generally remained in Rome, except for military campaigns, governing the provinces through appointed officials. Hadrian spent more than half his reign travelling, personally inspecting frontier defences, reviewing provincial administration, founding new cities, and involving himself in local affairs. These journeys were not ceremonial tours, but working visits where the emperor examined accounts, heard legal cases, inspected military installations, and made decisions affecting millions of people. This hands-on approach created stronger connections between the imperial centre and provincial populations, while allowing Hadrian to understand regional challenges that might be invisible from Rome. The travels also demonstrated imperial accessibility, showing provincials that they were valued members of the empire rather than merely subjects to be exploited. The construction of Hadrian's Wall across northern Britain between 122 128 CE exemplifies his approach to frontier defence and imperial strategy. Rather than attempting to conquer Scotland's fierce tribes at enormous cost, Hadrian chose to build a massive fortification that would secure Roman Britain while preventing barbarian raids. The wall stretched 73 miles from sea to sea, incorporating 17 major forts and numerous smaller installations, garrisoned by approximately 9,000 troops. This project required sophisticated engineering, careful logistical planning, and substantial financial investment, but it created a defensible frontier that protected Roman civilization for nearly 3 centuries. The wall also served psychological purposes, demonstrating Roman power to both subjects and enemies, while providing clear boundaries between civilization and barbarism. Archaeological evidence suggests the wall facilitated peaceful trade as well as military defense, with civilian settlements developing around military installations. Hadrian's cultural policies reveal his vision of the empire as a cosmopolitan civilization that could accommodate diverse traditions while maintaining Roman political unity. His passionate devotion to Greek culture, he established Athens as the intellectual centre of the Eastern Empire and founded the Panhellenean, a league of Greek cities, demonstrated respect for non-Roman traditions that earlier emperors had often viewed with suspicion. Yet this Philhellenism coexisted with policies promoting Roman law, Latin language and Roman political institutions throughout the empire. Hadrian founded numerous cities, typically named after himself, that served as centres for spreading Roman culture while incorporating local traditions. His architectural patronage produced the Pantheon in Rome, one of history's greatest buildings, which combined Roman engineering with Greek aesthetic principles. This synthesis of cultural traditions created a genuinely imperial civilization that was recognizably Roman, yet flexible enough to accommodate regional variations. The relationship between Hadrian and Antinous, a young man from Bithynia who became the emperor's beloved companion, provides insight into ancient attitudes towards sexuality, friendship and power that differ significantly from modern perspectives. Antinous joined Hadrian's court around 123 CE and accompanied the emperor on his travels until his mysterious death by drowning in the Nile in 130 CE. Hadrian's grief was profound and public. He founded the city of Antinopolis at the site of the drowning, declared Antinous a god, and established a religious cult in his honor. Ancient sources generally viewed this relationship matter-of-factly, understanding that powerful men often formed intense bonds with younger male companions. The emperor's deification of Antinous was more controversial, as it represented an unprecedented extension of imperial religious authority. Yet the cult of Antinous became remarkably popular throughout the empire, suggesting that Hadrian's grief resonated with his subjects' own experiences of love and loss. The Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea between 132–135 CE represents the darkest episode of Hadrian's reign and highlights the limits of imperial tolerance for cultural diversity. The rebellion was triggered by Hadrian's decision to rebuild Jerusalem as a Roman colony named Aelia Capitolina and to prohibit circumcision throughout the empire. These policies, intended to integrate Jewish communities into Greco-Roman culture, were perceived by many Jews as attacks on their religious identity. Led by Simon Bar Kokhba, whom many followers believed to be the Messiah, the revolt initially achieved remarkable success, establishing an independent Jewish state that lasted 3 years. The Roman response was massive and brutal. Hadrian deployed 12 legions, nearly a quarter of the entire imperial army, to suppress the rebellion. The resulting war devastated Judea, resulting in hundreds of thousands of casualties and the effective end of Jewish presence in their ancestral homeland until modern times. This tragedy illustrates how even well-intentioned imperial policies could have catastrophic consequences when they conflicted with deeply held religious beliefs. Hadrian's villa at Tivoli, constructed between 118–134 CE, serves as perhaps the most complete expression of his personality and vision of imperial culture. Covering over 300 acres, the villa complex included reproductions of famous buildings from throughout the empire: the Stoa Poikile from Athens, the Serapeum from Alexandria, the Canopus from Egypt, creating a kind of architectural encyclopedia of imperial civilization. The villa functioned simultaneously as a retreat from imperial responsibilities, a centre for intellectual activity, and a symbol of cultural synthesis. Its libraries, theatres, baths and gardens provided spaces for contemplation, entertainment and scholarly discussion. The complex demonstrates Hadrian's conception of the ideal imperial culture: cosmopolitan, intellectually sophisticated, artistically refined, yet fundamentally unified by Roman political authority. Archaeological excavations continue to reveal new aspects of the villa's design and function, confirming ancient descriptions of its extraordinary beauty and complexity. The philosophical tensions in Hadrian's reign between multiculturalism and Romanization reflect broader questions about how diverse societies can maintain unity while respecting difference. Hadrian's policies generally favored cultural accommodation, allowing local traditions to continue while gradually introducing Roman institutions and values. This approach proved successful in most regions, creating loyalty to the empire without destroying regional identities. Greek cities maintained their classical culture while accepting Roman political authority. Gallic aristocrats preserved their Celtic heritage while participating in Roman governance. Egyptian communities continued ancient religious practices while contributing to imperial prosperity. Yet the Bar Kokhba revolt demonstrated that some cultural differences were irreconcilable within the imperial framework. Jewish monotheism and ethnic exclusivity challenged Roman assumptions about religious pluralism and civic identity in ways that ultimately proved impossible to resolve peacefully. This tragic failure haunted imperial policy toward religious minorities for centuries to come. Titus Aurelius Fulvus Boionius Arrius Antoninus, known to history as Antoninus Pius, assumed imperial power in 138 CE under circumstances that demonstrated the maturation of the adoptive succession system. Hadrian had initially chosen Lucius Caonius Commodus as his heir, but when this candidate died unexpectedly, the emperor selected Antoninus with the requirement that he adopt both Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus as his own successors. This arrangement ensured imperial continuity for 2 generations while demonstrating the flexibility of merit-based succession. Antoninus was 51 when he became emperor, with extensive experience in provincial administration and legal practice, but no significant military background. His selection reflected Hadrian's judgment that the empire's needs had shifted from expansion and reorganization to consolidation and peaceful governance. The smoothness of this transition, accomplished without crisis or opposition, validated the wisdom of planned succession while demonstrating the political maturity achieved under the good emperors. The epithet Pius was awarded to Antoninus by the Senate in recognition of his filial devotion to Hadrian's memory, particularly his insistence on the former emperor's deification, despite senatorial opposition. This honor reflects the importance Romans placed on pietas, duty to family, ancestors and gods, as a fundamental virtue. Antoninus's piety was not merely ceremonial, but represented a consistent approach to governance, emphasizing tradition, stability and respect for established institutions. Throughout his 23-year reign, he maintained Hadrian's policies while avoiding dramatic innovations that might disrupt the peace and prosperity the empire had achieved. This conservative approach proved remarkably successful, providing the Roman world with nearly a quarter-century of unprecedented tranquility and prosperity. Modern historians sometimes characterize Antoninus's reign as boring, precisely because it lacked wars, scandals, or dramatic policy changes. A criticism that paradoxically highlights his achievement in creating conditions where ordinary people could live peaceful, productive lives. Antoninus's administrative competence manifested in countless small improvements that collectively transformed imperial governance. He streamlined legal procedures, reducing delays and costs, while ensuring consistent application of Roman law throughout the empire. His judicial decisions, carefully recorded and preserved, became precedents that influenced Roman jurisprudence for centuries. He maintained strict oversight of provincial governors, preventing the corruption and exploitation that had plagued earlier periods. His financial management was exemplary. The imperial treasury accumulated substantial surpluses while taxes remained stable and moderate. These achievements required no dramatic gestures or memorable speeches, but represented the patient, careful work of effective administration. The historian Edward Gibbon, writing in the 18th century, identified the reigns of Antoninus Pius and his immediate successors as the period when the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous, a judgment that reflects not exciting events, but the quiet competence of effective governance. The religious policies of Antoninus Pius demonstrate the successful integration of traditional Roman practices with the empire's growing religious diversity. Unlike some emperors who attempted to impose religious uniformity or introduce dramatic innovations, Antoninus maintained established practices while tolerating local variations. He supported traditional Roman cults, maintained state religious ceremonies, and ensured proper observance of imperial religious obligations. Yet he also permitted the continued spread of mystery religions, philosophical schools, and regional cults that appealed to different segments of the population. This balanced approach created religious stability while allowing for the spiritual diversity that characterized imperial society. His reign saw the continued growth of Christianity, though without the persecution that would mark later periods, suggesting that peaceful coexistence was possible when imperial authorities avoided unnecessary confrontation over religious matters. The prosperity of the provinces under Antoninus Pius provides compelling evidence for the benefits of competent imperial governance. Archaeological evidence from this period shows unprecedented levels of urban development, commercial activity, and private wealth throughout the empire. Cities expanded their public buildings, theatres, baths, forums, temples, while private residences grew larger and more luxurious. Trade networks connected regions that had never previously interacted, creating economic opportunities for merchants, craftsmen, and farmers. Population levels reached heights that would not be seen again in many regions until modern times. This prosperity was not accidental but resulted from deliberate policies, investment in infrastructure, protection of trade routes, stable currency, consistent legal frameworks, and prevention of warfare that disrupted economic activity. The reign of Antoninus Pius thus demonstrates how effective government can create conditions for human flourishing on an unprecedented scale. The Antonine constitution, though its exact provisions remain debated by historians, apparently regularized the process by which provincial communities could achieve Roman citizenship and municipal status. This policy represented the culmination of a centuries-long process of gradual integration, making it easier for local elites throughout the empire to participate fully in Roman political life. By Antoninus's death, the distinction between Romans and provincials had largely disappeared among the upper classes, creating a truly imperial aristocracy drawn from throughout the Mediterranean world. This integration strengthened the empire by expanding the pool of talent available for governance while reducing regional tensions that might have led to rebellion. The success of this policy is demonstrated by the loyalty shown to Rome even during later periods of crisis. Provincial populations generally supported imperial authority rather than seeking independence. The philosophical significance of Antoninus's reign lies in its demonstration that undramatic governance can be profoundly beneficial for human welfare. Modern political culture often emphasizes dramatic leadership, charismatic figures who promise revolutionary change or bold new directions. Antoninus represents an alternative model, the careful steward who maintains and gradually improves existing systems rather than attempting dramatic transformations. His reign suggests that consistent competence, attention to detail, and respect for established institutions may serve society better than charismatic innovation. This lesson remains relevant for contemporary discussions about political leadership, reminding us that effective governance often involves patient work that generates few headlines but creates conditions for widespread prosperity and peace. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus assumed imperial responsibilities in 161 CE as the culmination of the adoptive succession system, representing the closest approximation to Plato's ideal of the philosopher-king that history has yet produced. Born Marcus Annius Verus in 121 CE to a prominent Spanish family, he had been groomed for imperial succession from childhood, receiving an education that combined practical administrative training with intensive philosophical study. Hadrian had specifically required Antoninus Pius to adopt Marcus Aurelius as his heir, recognizing exceptional qualities that justified bypassing closer relatives. Unlike previous emperors who had developed philosophical interests after assuming power, Marcus Aurelius was already a committed Stoic philosopher when he became emperor, creating unprecedented opportunities to observe how philosophical principles might guide imperial governance. His personal notebooks, preserved as the Meditations, provide unique insight into the mind of an absolute ruler attempting to live according to rational and ethical principles. The early years of Marcus Aurelius's reign were complicated by the unusual arrangement of joint rule with Lucius Verus, Hadrian's other designated successor. This division of imperial authority was unprecedented, reflecting either Hadrian's uncertainty about choosing between the two candidates or his recognition that the empire had grown too large for effective governance by a single individual. Marcus Aurelius retained primary authority in Rome, while Lucius Verus commanded eastern campaigns against Parthia. This arrangement worked reasonably well initially, with Verus achieving significant military success in Armenia and Mesopotamia between 162–166 CE. However, the return of eastern armies brought a devastating plague that would ravage the empire for over a decade, creating challenges that would define Marcus Aurelius's entire reign. When Verus died suddenly in 169 CE, possibly from the plague, Marcus Aurelius assumed sole imperial authority at a time when the empire faced multiple crises simultaneously. The Antonine Plague, probably smallpox, represents one of history's great demographic catastrophes, killing an estimated 5 million people throughout the Roman Empire between 165–180 CE. The epidemic's origins in the Eastern campaigns highlight the interconnectedness of the ancient world. Diseases could spread along the same trade routes that brought prosperity, demonstrating the vulnerability of complex societies to biological threats. Marcus Aurelius confronted this challenge with characteristic philosophical equanimity, viewing the plague as a test of imperial leadership and personal virtue. He remained in Rome during the worst outbreaks, organizing relief efforts, maintaining government functions, and providing personal examples of courage in the face of mortality. His meditations contain numerous reflections on death and impermanence written during this period, revealing how Stoic philosophy helped him cope with unprecedented loss of life. The plague's long-term consequences, population decline, economic disruption, weakened military recruitment, would affect the empire for generations, marking the beginning of challenges that would eventually contribute to imperial transformation in later centuries. The Marcomannic Wars, fought intermittently between 166–180 CE, forced Marcus Aurelius to spend most of his later reign on the Danube frontier, confronting Germanic tribes whose pressure on Roman borders had intensified throughout the 2nd century. These conflicts differed from earlier imperial wars in their defensive rather than expansionist character. Marcus Aurelius fought not to acquire new territories, but to protect existing provinces from barbarian invasion. The emperor personally commanded armies in these campaigns, displaying military competence despite his preference for philosophical contemplation. Archaeological evidence suggests these wars were more serious than ancient sources indicate, requiring sustained military effort and substantial resources to resolve. The emperor's death in 180 CE while campaigning along the Danube symbolically marked the end of the empire's offensive phase and the beginning of a more defensive posture toward external threats. The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, written during his military campaigns and preserved through manuscript tradition, represent one of history's most remarkable documents, the private thoughts of an absolute ruler attempting to live according to philosophical principles. These personal notebooks, never intended for publication, reveal the emperor's struggles to reconcile Stoic ideals with the practical demands of imperial governance. He repeatedly reminds himself to remain calm in the face of frustration, to treat subjects justly regardless of their social status, to accept mortality while continuing to work for the common good, and to maintain perspective on the temporary nature of all human achievements. The philosophical depth of these reflections demonstrates that Marcus Aurelius was not merely an emperor who dabbled in philosophy, but a serious thinker whose intellectual development continued throughout his reign. The Meditations have influenced readers from medieval Christian theologians to modern secular philosophers, proving that insights gained from political experience can have universal application. The integration of philosophy and rulership in Marcus Aurelius's governance raises profound questions about the relationship between theoretical wisdom and practical power. Stoic philosophy emphasized virtue, duty, and acceptance of fate, principles that could guide personal conduct, but might seem inadequate for governing a vast empire facing multiple crises. Yet Marcus Aurelius demonstrated that philosophical principles could enhance rather than hinder effective leadership. His commitment to justice influenced legal reforms that protected slaves and gladiators from abuse while ensuring fair treatment for all social classes. His emphasis on duty motivated personal involvement in government despite his preference for contemplation. His acceptance of mortality gave him perspective on temporary setbacks while maintaining commitment to long-term imperial welfare. The emperor's example suggests that philosophical reflection, rather than being impractical idealism, can provide the emotional stability and moral clarity necessary for effective leadership during difficult periods. The column of Marcus Aurelius, erected after his death to commemorate the Marcomannic Wars, provides a fascinating comparison with Trajan's column while revealing changed attitudes toward warfare and imperial expansion. While Trajan's column celebrates conquest and expansion, Marcus Aurelius's column depicts defensive warfare against barbarian invasion, reflecting the empire's shift from offense to defense. The artistic style is more emotional and dramatic than the classical restraint of Trajan's monument, suggesting growing anxiety about external threats. Scenes of Roman brutality toward defeated enemies, rare in earlier imperial art, appear more frequently, indicating either changed artistic conventions or acknowledgement of warfare's harsh realities. The column's completion under Commodus, rather than Marcus Aurelius himself, symbolizes the discontinuity between the philosophical emperor and his unworthy successor, highlighting the adoptive succession system's ultimate failure. The choice of Commodus as successor represents Marcus Aurelius's greatest failure and the tragic end of the adoptive succession system that had served Rome so well for nearly a century. Unlike his predecessors, who had chosen heirs based on merit rather than blood relation, Marcus Aurelius designated his biological son despite clear evidence of Commodus's character flaws. This decision may have reflected paternal affection, concern about civil war if he bypassed his son, or simply the lack of obviously superior alternatives. Whatever his reasoning, the choice of Commodus proved catastrophic for the empire, ending the golden age of the good emperors and initiating a period of instability and decline. The emperor's failure in this crucial decision reminds us that even the wisest leaders are fallible humans whose personal attachments can override rational judgment. The contrast between Marcus Aurelius's philosophical wisdom and his practical failure regarding succession demonstrates the persistent tension between theoretical ideals and human reality that makes political philosophy such a challenging discipline. The five good emperors collectively achieved something unprecedented in human political history: nearly a century of competent, benevolent governance over a diverse population of perhaps 60 million people. Their success rested on several factors that combined to create optimal conditions for effective imperial administration. The adoptive succession system ensured that power passed to individuals with proven competence rather than genetic heirs of uncertain ability. The empire's geographic extent had reached sustainable limits, eliminating the costs and risks of further expansion while providing defensible frontiers. Economic prosperity created resources for public works, military expenses, and social welfare without excessive taxation. Cultural integration had progressed sufficiently to create imperial unity while maintaining regional diversity. Perhaps most importantly, each emperor understood his role as serving the empire's welfare rather than merely exercising personal power, creating a tradition of public service that influenced their successors' behavior. The philosophical legacy of the good emperors extends far beyond their immediate historical impact, providing models of leadership that continue to influence political thought. Their demonstration that autocratic power could serve the common good challenged republican assumptions about the inherent corruption of one-man rule, while offering alternatives to democratic governance that seemed more practical for large, diverse societies. Their integration of different cultural traditions created templates for managing diversity within political unity that remain relevant for modern multicultural societies. Their emphasis on merit-based succession offered alternatives to both hereditary monarchy and competitive democracy that deserve continued study. Most significantly, their collective achievement demonstrated that political institutions, however well designed, ultimately depend on the character and wisdom of the individuals who operate them, a lesson that remains as relevant today as it was 2 millennia ago. The end of this golden age with Commodus's succession reminds us of the fragility of political achievement and the difficulty of institutionalizing wisdom and virtue. The good emperors succeeded partly through fortunate circumstances, the absence of major external threats, economic prosperity, and the availability of exceptional individuals to serve as emperors. When these conditions changed, the system they had created proved vulnerable to the same problems that had plagued earlier periods: civil war, tyranny, and governmental failure. Yet their achievement remains inspiring precisely because it demonstrates human potential for creating just and beneficial governance, even under conditions of absolute power. Their example continues to challenge us to consider how contemporary political systems might better serve human welfare while managing the inevitable tension between individual freedom and collective needs that defines all political life.